Hey, welcome back, guys. So in the last video we talked about loops and how you can use loops to perform tasks that are repetitive, and it's really powerful what you can do with for loop. Especially we saw how we're able to create this multiplication table, and this is just one of those things you can do with loops. With just this single line of code we were able to let me run this and show you. Actually, I have this already, so I'll just go ahead and open the console and hold on. Cool. So with just this one single line of code, we were able to create this multiplication table, and we can change this to say 8 or even 9. So remember to change this, and then I save, and then this gives us a multiplication table of 9. Cool. And I can even make it multiply up until 100, up until 9 times 100, by just changing this to 100, and I save. And you see, so this is really amazing. Now we want to extend things. We want to take things a bit further by looking at functions. Now, the real beauty of programming is the fact that you are able to write pieces of code that do a particular task, and then you just call it when you need it, right? And that is where function shines. So really, function is a fundamental concept in programming generally, and in JavaScript it's no different. So what function basically gives you is a reusable piece of code. So the piece of code could be maybe doing a calculation, or it can just be outputting something to the console, right? So that is what function is. Just um think about it as a set of tasks that a computer will follow to complete to complete a particular goal. So think of it like, let's say you want to cook, and then you get a recipe which is a block of instructions on how to cook a particular dish, right? So whenever you want to cook that dish, you just look at that recipe and follow the instructions, follow the set of instructions. So that's how functions are in JavaScript. So think about it as a packaged piece of, or a packaged set of instruction that a computer follows to complete a particular task, right? So let's see. As far as creating functions is concerned, let's see the basic syntax. So you start with the function keyword. Okay, so start with a function keyword, and then you follow it by the name of the function. So think of this name as the identifier, and all the rules for naming variables apply also when you want to choose an identifier for your function. An identifier for your function. So all those other rules for naming variables still apply. You don't start with a number, and you don't use minors, you don't use name that has space in between them. So let's say we have a function, call it greet. Okay, so that's the name of the function, and then we follow it with a parenthesis, and we follow it with curly brackets. Now our function body will go inside the curly bracket. We could write inside it like this, but you know sometimes our function can be big, and a single function can span multiple lines, although it's usually advisable to keep our functions really short. But the fact is, a single function can span multiple lines, so it makes sense to bring it down like this. It's still the same thing. Okay, so what this function is going to do is to just console log how are you in the console. So we'll say console dot log. You know what, I'll just say good morning. Of course, I'll put it inside the string. Good morning, and then I save. And this is a basic function syntax. Every time you want to create a function, this is the syntax. Start with the function keyword, follow it by the name of the function, and this is whatever you choose. You can call it whatever you want, but make sure you follow the rules for naming variables. I'll probably leave a link in the description of this video so that you can see again the rules for naming variables. Okay, and then if we check the console, we should see good morning. Now, maybe not yet. So let me reload this. This good morning mark is actually coming from somewhere else and I need to get rid of it. So, okay. So there's really nothing in the console. So there are two steps to actually making a function. Now, one is to make the function, which we have done. We've created the function. Remember I said you call functions on demand. You use functions on demand. You can create a function and then you're not using it. So whenever you need it, you just call it. Okay, so right now we've created the function. Now we want to use it. What do? We call it. And the way we call a function is to put we call it by name really. So we'll call the identifier and follow it by parentheses, just like this. So and then you see good morning in the console coming from line 82. Okay, so let's say calling the function. So this is how you call a function. Okay, now let's do one more example. Okay, so let's do one more example. Let's actually see a function that does something more complex. So we can say function. Now remember, this for loop that we have here, we can actually put it inside a function, right? So let's just say function multiplication. So just say multiply. We keep our function as short as possible. Okay, and then we are going to copy our, then put it here, and then I'm gonna just comment this guy out, and then I'll call this multiply function. All right. Excuse me. Remember, so what I've done is we have a function and that function is running a for loop. Okay, so you can see what functions can do for us. You can actually use it to package things you want to do. So let's say we want to have our program, but anytime we want to run this for loop, we don't have to start typing it from the beginning. We just call this function that is running it. I hope that makes sense. So if I comment this out and I look at the console, actually of course it shouldn't. Okay, it's because of this. It's coming from here. So if I save this, so you see now there's nothing inside this console, but I have this function here. It's not running because I've not called this function. Okay, so the moment I call this function, you see our multiplication table is output in the console. So the beauty of this is you can have a function that performs a particular task and then you get the output of that task every time you call the function and only when you call the function. All right, so that's the beauty of function. And like I said, if we want to be able to get this result now, we don't have to write this again. We just call the function whenever we need this output. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So that is that on functions, and really there's really no limit to the functions that you can create. You can create a function to do about anything you can think of. Now let's extend this a little bit. Now the beauty of function is that it is able to take inputs and return outputs. So let's talk about, you know what, let's give this some so first we talk about basic syntax. So we saw basic syntax, how to actually create a function and call a function. So under basic syntax, we saw make a function and call a function. Calling functions. Second, we want to talk about function parameters and arguments. Okay, that's the second thing I want us to talk about. Let's get rid of these guys. Now, to talk about function parameters and arguments. Now, functions, because functions are reusable pieces of code that can perform a particular task, you can actually make a function really dynamic so that you can pass an input to it. All right. So think about it as you are invoking a function to do a particular thing, but you are also giving it an input that it is going to work with. So let's think of our multiplication table example that we used earlier, or let's do something really simple. So let's say we have a function that adds two numbers together. So let's create a function called add, and then all it does is just say it has number 1, let num1 5, and we say let num2 10, and then we now say console.log num1 multiplied by num2. Okay, so what do you think we are going to see on the console? This console is going to return the product of num1 and num2. So let's confirm that. Okay, so there's really nothing in the console. Can you guess why? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, so the reason is because we have a function, but we are not calling it yet. Again, we call our function. You must always call your functions to be able to get the result from that function. So let's say add, and then just like that. Okay, and then we say 50 in the console now. So it's doing the actually I said add, but I'm multiplying. So let's do what our function says. Excuse me. Okay, so it says 15. That's correct. Very simple. 5 plus 10 is 15. You probably don't need a function to do that, but yeah, you get the point. Now, every time I call this function, I'm always going to get 15 because it is using the numbers that I defined within the function. Now, what if I want, when I call this function, I want to decide what numbers I want to add when I call the function? So it doesn't always have to be 5 and 10. So every time every time I call this function, I want to be able to say, okay, I want to multiply different set of numbers. So that way it is really dynamic. So that is where function parameters and arguments come in. So how would we achieve that? The way we can do that is to come to this place. The parenthesis is immediately after the name of the function, and we add something we call parameters. So parameters are like variables that we use within our function. Now, passing them as parameters makes it dynamic because while creating the function, we have them as parameters, so we can operate on them however we want. But they get their real values from when we call the function. So when we call the function, we pass their real values, and that function call, we use those values that we passed and then do the computation. For instance, I'm going to get rid of this num1 and num2. Instead, I'm going to have it as num1, num2, that's first and second number. Okay, so this is still very valid, but right now when I call this function, the function doesn't know what num1 and num2 is, but think about it as a placeholder for any number that I want to multiply. So they get their real values when I call the function. I simply add whatever I want to add. So I simply pass whatever I want to add, and it has to be 2. So we say that this function has 2 parameters, and then it's expecting 2 arguments when I call it. So I say 20 and 15. Now when I check my console, I'm going to say 35. Cool. So what's happening here? It is adding 20 and 15, and that obviously is 35. So what have we done? We created a function called add, and we passed 2 parameters to it, and then we added those parameters and log the sum to the console. And then when we call the function, we pass a value to those parameters, and then our function uses those arguments to do the computation and give us the value. If I change this to 2 and 1, the value is going to change to 3. You see that? So just to get the terminologies really well, when you are creating a function, the variables you pass is called function parameters. Now when you are calling the function, the values you assign to those parameters are called arguments. Okay, so let's take one more example. So let's say we just another example. So let's use a name, for instance. So just call it username, and then we want to say good morning, and we want to just pass the username. So we'll say, actually not good morning, let's say how are you, and then we add username. So when we call this function, now the name should change. I mean, you don't have to change the name, but it makes sense to change the name. So just like variable names, I told you the rules for naming variable applies even for choosing name of functions. And just like when you're naming variables, the name you give a function should be descriptive of what the function is doing. So it doesn't make sense to have a function that says greet and then, or that adds and it's just saying how are you. It doesn't make sense. Okay, so now this our greet function is expecting how many parameters? Just 1, and its username. So when we call greet, we are going to pass a parameter that and it's a string really. So we can say James. Okay, so it's going to take this value and then use it to complete this sentence. So if you look at the console, you're going to see how are you, James. Now I'm not stuck with whatever name I put here. Whenever I call the function, I can put whatever value I want it to output. I can say something like Mark, and it outputs it just like that. So this is how you create really dynamic code with function. Now let's do something about this. Let's do something fun with that multiplication table. So I'm going to create a function that does that multiplication table and does it in a really dynamic way. So I'll say function multiply again, multiply. Now this time around we want to decide, we want to be able to pass the number we want to multiply as a parameter. So we'll say number, and then we just put this guy inside here. Now something interesting I want you to note here is no, we're not going to need to say we want to multiply by 9 or we want to multiply by 7. We just choose whatever number we multiply by at the points when we want to call the function, and we pass it as the function argument. So this is going to be number. Okay, so this is a much more dynamic. Actually, we're not going to need this also. It's also going to come from whatever we pass here. So we can say number okay, so hopefully this makes sense. So you see now, when I call this function, I will pass whatever number I want us to multiply by. So let's, of course, if you look at the console now, there's nothing there, but the moment I call this function multiply, and then I pass, let's say I want to multiply by 12, and then I check my console, I see. So it is doing 12 times 1 up until 12 times 100. Okay, so I can even make the number of multiplications I want to do dynamic. So let's say I want to, because if you see now it's saying 100. So what if I want to make this dynamic also? I can just add this as another argument. I will say multiply number, I can say limit, I'll call this limit, and then I remove this, I say limit. Cool. And then I pass 12, and I want to do multiplication table of 12 up until 12. Okay, so you see, let's say 12 times 1, and this is up until 12. I can change this one, say I want to do multiplication table of 5 up until 12. Let me leave this at 12. So it says 5 times this. So whenever I call this function, I decide what I want to multiply and up till which number I want to multiply. So this really makes this very dynamic. Not only do I not have to rewrite this loop, I also can decide what parameters to use when I invoke the function. That is really cool. So in the next video, I'm going to be showing you other things that you need to know about functions. So for now, we've been able to cover the basic syntax of how to create function, how to call function, and how to pass function arguments and function parameters. Now in the next video, we're going to talk about how to return a value from a function, so that you by just invoking the function, you get the value that it returns. And let's talk about that in the next video.